Okay, I think I'm going to start. Welcome everybody to this joint NEDLAC MISTRA webinar. This is the second in a series of 2 webinars that we are organizing NEDLAC together with MISTRA to really reflect on some of the lessons that we've learned as stakeholders and as a country in relationship to the COVID-19 pandemic. Within NEDLAC, we have had a NEDLAC Rapid Response Task Team since the start of the epidemic, where organized business, labor, community, and government collaborated in extraordinary ways and ways that, we haven't in the past. And we thought that as we wind down the work of the task team, that we should really reflect on the lessons. So 2 weeks ago, we looked at what we call social contracting, which was the relationship between government and the people. And today we're really looking at partnering or social compacting, which is the relationship between organized stakeholders. And we have invited today a broad panel, some of which, in fact, many of them, most, have been integrally involved in the NEDLAC Rapid Response Task Team. But we've also invited Andrew Borain, who was also involved in partnerships, more at a local level, because we think that it's important to mix and match and share these experiences. And then also, as the participants, we have invited people who've been very close to the process and who we hope will share as we evaluate and reflect, as well as others who have not been so close to the process to also bring in their perspectives. And we hope that after these reflections, as well as internal reflections, we will do a report, recommendations about what we can learn and what government and other social partners should take forward. So my name is Lisa Seftler, I'm the head of NEDLAC, and I'm going to hand over to Nia Momudu, who was one of the people close to the process. She's from Organized Business, and she will be facilitating the session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Edie, and good morning. Good morning as well to the COO of MISTRA, Aba Oma, a distinguished panelists, distinguished delegates, and members of the media. Like Lisa said, my name is Neo Momodu, and if I'm not at NEDLAC, I'm the executive for Legal, Regulatory, and Sustainability at the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa. Edie, I'm sure we all are aware that when South Africa was first faced with the enormous task of combating COVID-19, it became very apparent that government could not address the challenges alone. So therefore, government needed the support of the social partners, and naturally, NEDLAC became the platform that was approached by government to assist, whether from procurement of PPEs to issues of food security, to community mobilization, communication of vaccination messages, mobilization of social grants, both for ordinary citizens and labor movements. Social partners proved to be a critical force to help the country's effort to fight the effects of the pandemic. But one may ask, what is it that made the social partnership successful? And I think it's because it was embedded on various principles that are really, really critical. Edie, I'm going to share my screen because I think it's important that I actually do just show this, because when you see it visually, you'll understand the importance of it. And I'm looking at the side now where there are boxes where we're talking about the principles. The first principle was that there was a shared purpose and shared goals, that social partners had this goal amongst them that we needed to save lives and livelihoods. The second thing that made the partnerships very strong was that there was a strong and well-defined leadership. Each constituency of the social partners identified leaders who were the face of the engagement and who took accountability and responsibility in ensuring that each of the constituencies contributed equally and made a difference within that social partnership. There was trust and trustworthiness. And this defines that, the way we were interdependent, the partnership worked because amongst us, there was trust that we were going to work in unison and make things happen. There was also integrity. We operated with integrity. And this was really important, particularly as we know at the time, there was a lot that marred the environment where with PPE procurement and other corruptions that, created scandals. So it was very important that the people that were there acted with integrity. And then there was engagement and communication, that between us, we ensured that we had regular meetings, and I think we were working around the clock at some time, at some stage. And through GCIS as well, communicated key messages to the communities and making sure that we took people along through the process. And then the last one was inclusive governance. And I will come back to this one at a later stage, because through the net joins partnerships, we're able to interact with the NCCC ministers at the time, making recommendations and suggestions of how we saw the partnership working into the long term. Sometimes it was successful, but others it was not. So the next slide deals with the saving lives and livelihoods. What did it actually mean? We know that the thrust and the common purpose, as I did say, was that, guys, whatever we do, the underlying principles should be that of saving lives and livelihoods. But there were trade-offs, in the process. So while we can argue that the closures at some point helped curb the spread of the virus, they inevitably, impacted the welfare of households, as we know, particularly those that are most vulnerable. Various businesses had suffered severe economic strains, and some of them were decimated. And we know that the worst that were affected were the tobacco, the liquor, the restaurant sector, tourism, and entertainment sector that's recently opened. And for months, actually years, they went without income. The restrictions, the closures were particularly devastating for the SMME sector. And I know that close to 1.6 million jobs were lost during this period. And when we talk about liquor and tobacco, one of the unintended consequences is that we are now dealing with illicit products in the market. Cigarettes, I think more than 50% now of cigarettes that is sold on the market is illicit. And that is one of the consequences of the closures, that people found other alternatives, and the channels that are illegal started finding ways into the market. And this has resulted in losses of about 6.4 billion to our revenue. So, and we also know that, during the time of COVID, while there were positive outcomes, South Africa was technically in a recession, right? That, there were pressures on national treasury, and the additional pressure from the COVID response, whether it was about sourcing vaccines or the relief measures that were put in place, put additional burdens on treasury. And Moody's at the time had downgraded us to junk status. It was unfortunate. And all of these things, including COVID, contributed to an economic crisis, which, as we know now, is also compounded by the effects of the war in Ukraine. And we also know that during that time as well, we experienced the civil unrest in KZN and parts of Gauteng, where, because from the Consumer Goods Council perspective, we represent a number of retailers and manufacturers. We know that 800 shops were looted and burned, and the cumulative loss that came out of that was about 50 billion, and 5 billion of that was suffered directly by the retail sector. Why am I bringing this economic argument in play? Is despite the fact that as a country, we recognize that we were suffering severe economic challenges, that people were losing their jobs, we were very slow in changing, this thrust of saving lives and livelihoods. And sometimes, even when evidence showed that there was no need to keep certain sectors of the economy closed, we continued in that light. I know now we can look back in hindsight and want to change the way we did things, but I think going forward, we need to, as a country, look at the local sort of challenges and dynamics and be guided by, what it is that may work best, so that we do not actually put a strain on the social welfare. I think it's going to take a while for South Africa to get to a point that it was pre-COVID, the recession. And we need to work together to recognize that some of the things that may need to change, and I'm going to go to my last slide, is that we need to continue supporting the vaccination program. I know, working with GCIS, that they are still pushing those messages of saying second boosters, third boosters, because COVID is something that we're going to live with in the long term. We have seen, recently, every day now, that service delivery protests are becoming a norm in South Africa. And between us as social partners, we need to look and work together towards, driving a change in how service delivery is provided to our people. We need to invest in our communities and address the socio-economic challenges of food security, job creation, as well as good health and well-being. And the SMME sector is in dire need of support, particularly those that were affected by COVID-19. We need to look at localization and how we can actually support the implementation of the master plans. And here, we're pleading with some of our social partners to actually look at the regulatory environment, that we're seeing more and more, policies that are coming, or regulations that are coming from government that are introduced without actually doing the necessary CR studies and the economic impact. And we're pleading with government in particular, and when I talk about this, the master plans, one of them being the HPL, if we carry on increasing taxes, we are going to find ourselves further decimating and actually impacting industries. And we need to look at this regulatory red tape that the president was referring to, that we start looking at unlocking opportunities for business. And the last one is for us to look at issues of climate change and the sustainable development goals, and how we can, as a country, work towards making life better for all. With those few remarks, Edie, I'd like to introduce the speakers of today, which, as you know, are very esteemed speakers. And like you said, some of them were critically and actively involved in the process. And the first that I would like to introduce is Sitapane Mohale, who was with the Net Joints and the Net Joints Work Streams Coordinator. Sitapane, can I hand over to you to talk to us about collaboration between government and social partners under the state of disaster? And before you come in, our speakers were given, these particular topics, but to also answer two critical questions: what worked and what did not work in respect of the social partnerships, and the lessons that we can learn for future crises and pandemics. Over you to Sitapane, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to stop sharing.
And good morning to all the colleagues at MISTRA, the NRTT, and everybody online.
Sorry, Sitapane, I'm not sure if it's just me, but you're not audible. Is it just
okay?
Me?
And let me speak a bit. I'm not shy to be too loud, but let me try to share the screen. Can the chair stop sharing, and then I'll share from my side? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have stopped sharing. We can't see your screen, the presentation yet. There we go. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and good morning once more. As you had indicated, Chairperson, we have been given a tight 10 minutes, focusing on the lessons learned. As introduced by the Chair, my name is Sitapane Mohale. I was working as the coordinator of the work streams, and we'll get into how they were composed, but also the key lessons learned. as directed by the chair, as well as some of the successes. And in this regard, we are going to highlight the data and information sharing, as well as the National Communications Partnership, and make some observations in terms of some of the work going forward. Chairperson, the work streams that we had under the COVID-19, I think that there are three important points to make in this regard. There were 8 of them drawn from different government departments. And the first important lesson was to organize them around specific outcomes and objectives rather than with their normal cluster presentations. But another key lesson that we will touch on a bit later is that as much as they had to be focused on the outcomes and objectives of the day, that dotted line back to their clusters became very important in terms of making these work streams both responsive in the short term, but able to identify issues for the long term that can be deposited into these other structures of government for monitoring and for taking out medium-term projects. So we had the social sector risk mitigation, protection of vulnerable persons. That was the work stream that was broadly called social impact mediation, linking back to the social cluster. And here we had to adapt into a tripartite chairing chairperson to deal with all of the myriad of the issues, whereas in the social cluster, the chairmanship is slightly different. What became clear is that we needed a capacity from the monitoring and evaluation department in terms of identifying where gaps were in service delivery, but also in documenting, for the future. The inclusion of the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability at the co-chairing level as well, to address that early identified challenge of the second pandemic, and how that did not go off the table as we were dealing with issues of the social sector risk mitigation, and then of course the Department of Social Development. We had at the core of this, of course, the public health and infections containment work stream, which linked back to the social cluster, but which, as I'll indicate later, was also directly reporting to the Ministry of Health. In the natural work streams, this was co-chaired by the Department of Health and the National Disaster Management Center. We made this point again in terms of lessons learned for the long term. One of the key issues in terms of phasing out of that reactive emergency approach was the ability to build in the lessons learned into departmental and other organs of state own planning frameworks, making sure that they had disaster management plans in place. And this is one of the key lessons learned, was how quickly we built that in so that we move out of the emergency approach. The other one, maybe I'll touch on here, Chair, was the economic impact mediation work stream, which the early success of that was in identification of the need for that economic reconstruction and recovery package, which was then hived out of the natural instructions, taken back to the cluster, and there was a strengthened partnership with social partners in terms of developing it further, and then its monitoring and evaluation. Then there were a myriad of other justice, crime prevention work streams dealing with issues that were obviously flowing into the other work streams. And one of the earlier lessons learned, Chairperson, was the importance of syndication. So where in early days, these work streams were working almost as separate silos. You would see some of the contradiction between public health and infections containment measures and the economic impact mediation that the chair spoke to as well. or in the travel restrictions and border management, and then some disjunction with, again, economic or even social impact. As I indicated, the key success stories here, Chairperson, would be
Sorry,
the yes, yes.
You are fading in and out. Maybe come closer to your mic and keep to one position, because at some points you're very audible and others not at all.
All right. Is this better here?
Yes, it sounds much better.
Okay, thank you for catching me before thank you for catching me, Chairperson, before I went too far. In that, let me also apologize for failing to mute the phone. But I was making the point that a key lesson learned was the need for syndication between the work streams, and the success story that we're going to touch on a bit later, being the work around communication and community mobilization, as well as the National Data and Policy Observatory, and how that was able to work in with the other work streams, just to provide the basis for an evidence-based approach, which really did help to build trust as well going forward. In terms of how we had worked, then just those work streams, those sub-work streams, took their marching orders from the NCCC, which then gave directions through the NACJoint's co-chairs to the DG structure, which had reporting to it then the workstream chairs. And as indicated, having a syndication of the workstream chairs was one of the early successes. It made it easier for us to then engage with the NRTT, because when all of these work streams, as indicated, Chair, have got their own history or dotted line with standard clusters and departments, which have got their own social dialogue processes that were really underway at NEDLAC, and being able to pull them together and to build that syndication between the work streams, but then that link directly between all the work stream chairs, as well as the NACJoint's NRTT, allowed us to get a full view back to the work streams, as well as their cluster links. There was, and I think that this is one of the key lessons learned, Chair, around building in this alignment also with the health contingent. It was, of course, an ongoing a process in terms of getting all of these inputting partners. For the NACJoint's, of course, the PHIC stands for Public Health and Infectious Containment, was our key link into this process, but they also had their own vertical integration work to do as the Ministry of Health, which sometimes brought in recommendations after the other consultations had happened. So the key lesson around how we integrate all of the expert advisory groups, the broad public input with this other structure that then was able to coordinate with the NRTT was a key lesson learned. So to get to the meat and potatoes of it, Chair, in terms of what worked and what didn't work, we'll start with we'll just call it key risks, and this we've been open about with the principals, is that the lack of a defined terms of reference with clear responsibilities is a clear risk. And though these were developed and as indicated in terms of moving towards an outcomes and objectives approach, building in the syndication, and then clearly defining our relationship with the NRTT. If we do this again, Chairperson, it has to be clear from the start, with constant engagement, of course, and refining and adaptation of those working relationships as we go on. These are some of them, obviously, they'll speak to each other, but an early concern, I hope I'm still audible, Chair. An early concern was around the issue of leaking of information. It was a concern raised from the natural instructions in terms of the building of trust, and an early adaptation was the adaptation or the adoption of confidentiality agreements, which allowed us to move beyond reactive approach to consultation and to start opening up in terms of what is it that we are considering, what are our marching orders, and what is the information before us. A big one, Chair, in terms of the feedback, and this comes both ways, is how we composed ourselves. And I think that this is the one that we also escalated, is over and above making sure that there's coordination between the work streams and getting everybody in the room who needs to be in the room. It's also about getting the right people in the room, so that we don't have multiple meetings, and that there is a clear indication that those in the room are able to take decisions, and as well as to advise the principals and have clear access to the principals. So a key lesson is the need for this to be clearly put into the terms of references, as well as aligned to the objectives. So who is the right people in the room has to be aligned to that, clearly defining those responsibilities, and also, as indicated, being flexible, Chairperson, about how we compose ourselves, even in the NRTT structures, in terms of, yes.
I'm looking at time, and unfortunately, your video is not, your audio is not getting any better. Maybe what we can do is share most of these key lessons in the Q&A and during discussion, because I am getting quite a number of people, both on WhatsApp and here, to say that they can hardly hear. So if you don't mind, and also in the interest of time, stay with us, please, if you can, and then through the Q&A section, then we can actually get more input from you. And maybe by that time, your audio will be much better and your connection. Thank you, Sitapane. Really, really appreciate the input so far. And, if we can move to the next speaker, who is Andrew Borain, who is from the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership, and he will be talking to us on collaboration between government and social partners around COVID-19 food, the food crisis. Andrew, if we can move over to you, thank you very much.
Thanks, Neo. Can you see the screen okay? And can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Morning, everyone.
Hear you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Neo. Thanks for this opportunity. Very briefly, I'd like to cover, I'd like to give you an example of social compacting or partnering from below as a response to the COVID crisis. I'd like to then indicate how we were able to sustain the partnership beyond the crisis, and then pull out some partnering lessons, what works, what doesn't, to help diverse sectors work together in practice. So just to start off with, what problem were and are we still solving for? And I think the point I'd like to make here is that the impact of the COVID pandemic made an existing problem of food insecurity a lot worse. Before COVID, over a quarter of children in South Africa under 5 are stunted, which is a disastrous figure, which hasn't changed in 5 decades. The response to COVID had to steer, as the chair said, a difficult path between saving lives and preserving livelihoods. And we know that the impact of lockdown on access to food in poor and vulnerable communities was catastrophic. Almost immediately, within days, civil society, amongst others, sprang into action. And within a couple of weeks, there were literally hundreds of community kitchens and food kitchens up and running. within the first 4 or 5 months, we saw the growth of about 160 community action networks just in Cape Town. Our job as the EDP was to coordinate this food effort, the food relief effort in poor and vulnerable communities through what became known as the Western Cape Food Forum. We organized around the slogan of connect, communicate, and collaborate. And we drew in 3 different types of civil society organizations. Firstly, the mainstream food NPOs that were already in existence. Secondly, as many of the grassroots community responses that we could find, including the CANs, the food kitchens, the faith-based organizations, ecumenical movements. And then interestingly enough, there was a group of what we call intermediary funding and supply networks, which included business, farmers, donors, retail, who were supporting the grassroots networks. So those 3 types of organizations and structures we drew into the forum. And then from the public sector, the Western Cape government had organized its humanitarian cluster with a cross-cutting 8 departments, which was very helpful. And the first lesson that one learns is if government organizes itself across departments, it's much easier for civil society and communities to work with government. And then we also drew in the municipalities. This is the timeline for the first 6 months. And the point I'd like to make here is that during the first 4 months, civil society food relief in the Western Cape amounted to just over 5.2 million food people days, which was an indicator we devised to measure food relief. And this is estimated to have contributed about 60% of the total food relief effort. So government combined, all 3 spheres, provided about 40% of the food aid. And this puts the role of civil society in the context. Civil society generally was able to mobilize a lot quicker and more nimbly than government did. And the results certainly showed. I think also one saw in this time pioneering of digital food vouchers, as opposed to the more cumbersome food parcels to households. Digital food vouchers could get much quicker to collective strategies at a community level, rather than just supporting individual parcels, individual households. And so I think that there were some interesting innovations that occurred during this time. The point I'd like to make here is that by September, October, we deliberately decided to pivot. We had learned from the water crisis in Cape Town a few years earlier that the window for opportunity for sustaining effort closes quite quickly. And we wanted to continue with the work beyond food relief and start looking at a food systems, a more systemic response. And so one of the approaches that we had adopted through this food forum was what we'd call an adaptive approach, where we step into action together. We don't wait too long to plan. But as we are stepping into action, we constantly pause, reflect, and learn, and then adapt and adjust the strategy of everyone, and then we repeat. And so you'll see there by October, in the first year of the crisis, we were already assessing how are these the lessons for building back better together, and what are the partnering lessons we are learning, and how do we segue from food relief to looking at the more fundamental long-term issues of challenging the existing food and nutrition system. This obviously called for a systems approach, and the challenge always is how to translate a highly conceptual framework beloved of many academics and researchers into concrete action from practitioners on the ground. And so the first thing that we did is we reached out to new partners in different parts of the food and nutrition system. Obviously, the 70 or 80 NGOs and community-based structures that we were already working with only occupy a part of the overall food system. And then we secondly looked at building a common agenda around shortening the food supply system, around the slogan, local production for local consumption, to bring food producers closer to food consumers. This required us to map out all the actors in the Western Cape food system, which you can see there, from the producers, the logistics, the distributors, the wholesalers, the retailers, right through to the processing of food waste. And then through the Western Cape Food Forum, we broadened our activities to engage with different organizations in different parts of the food system and mobilize a much broader coalition than we had done in the first year around food relief. This started influencing public policy and what government was doing. And by 2021, the Western Cape government had set up what they call a Nourish to Flourish program, which started engaging with pilot sites on the ground. And this program has turned into 3 practical steps to strengthen local food systems, which I've detailed there. You map the elements that potentially make the difference between surviving and thriving. You map the linkages between these elements to public sector functions, budgets, programs, and projects, and then you work to create enabling environment for non-state actors and initiatives. And this is an example from an engagement with the Breeder Valley municipality of teasing out what a municipality should be doing, what a provincial government and what national government departments could be doing to support and enhance local food systems in poor and vulnerable areas. And then final 2 slides. One of the things that we've got to address is the fragmented nature of food system governance in this country. There's no Ministry of Food. And the difficulty, therefore, is that there are parallel and sometimes competing definitions of food security. Some people focus on producing more, others focus on rural development, others focus on the urban systems, others focus on the safety nets. This has got to be integrated into a single public policy. And there are policy tensions between the economic focus, the environment focus, and the societal focus. So final partnering lessons. A crisis can create space for change, but you must move quickly, otherwise that space closes. It's important to collect practitioners engaged in short-term relief mobilization to long-term food systems change. It's a both and, not an either or. Thirdly, a whole of government approach is necessary to support a whole of society approach. If government doesn't get its act together, it's very hard to bring in the business and community sector and academics and researchers. Fourthly, it's always helpful to connect what we call the bottom-up mobilizing and activating environment to top-down authorizing environment. Fifthly, don't spend too much time in deliberation and dialogue. Build trust in action as soon as possible, and then reflect, pause, reflect, learn, adapt, and adjust. And then sixthly, it is sometimes helpful to have what we call collaborative intermediary organizations to convene safe spaces and provide a neutral platform. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Very insightful lessons here. And I think ones that we should actually, pay attention to, because issues of food security, like I said in my presentation, that one of the critical things that we have to do as a country is to espouse and actually act on the SDGs. And, issues of food security are at the forefront of the work that we need to do. And we've noticed, particularly during the riots as well, that the system is still not together in terms of getting all the value chain stakeholders organized so that we move very, very quickly in ensuring that those that are in need of food get that very, very quickly. Thank you very much for that contribution. And we'll now move to our next speaker, who is Wendy Clow from the Solidarity Fund. And she will share with us the experience of the Solidarity Fund. As we know, they were very, very critical in ensuring that from a monetary perspective and collaboration perspective, we acted very, very swiftly and decisively during the crisis. Wendy, over to you. Thanks. You're on mute still, Wendy.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely, thanks.
Thanks, Neo, and good morning, everybody. We're quite pleased to be part of this discussion. Because we do believe that we did play a critical role as part of the partners in delivering against what I think Neo called a shared purpose and goal of really making sure that we save lives and we save livelihoods. As you all know, Solidarity Fund was set up was announced rather by the president on the 23rd of March in 2020. It all seems like a very long time ago because we've been through a lot as a country. And essentially, the genesis of how the fund operated was that, firstly, I think it was to acknowledge that we're quite unique in the world. I think we're probably the only country that set up a vehicle such as this one. And really set up as a multi-sectoral rapid response vehicle that worked with government and supported government, worked closely with business in terms of collaborations and partnerships, and did what we'd like to think is a highly coordinated response, ultimately for the common good. And I think, and I'm hoping that it set the bar globally for how collaborations and multi-sectoral, I think, not just approaches and concepts, but plans that actually have an impact on people's lived realities in a very positive way can be done. Initially, our focus was directed or redirected, as we came to learn, to the needs of the country as they changed. I mean, we went from different phases of the pandemic where initially we needed to just inform people and educate people about what this virus was all about, to quickly pivoting to assisting with buoying up the health system to be able to be ready to assist South Africans who are admitted to the various levels of hospitals across the country, then quickly talking about waves, and then leading up to, you all know the discourse around whether we're going to get vaccines, are we going to get them on time, which ones are we going to get, and who's going to be eligible for the vaccines, and all manner of things until the vaccine rollout. So there were many redirections in terms of the focus of the fund. Initially, we had 3 pillars to the fund: the health response, the humanitarian response, as well as behavior change, which is one of the fancier ways of talking about, I guess, a combination of, marketing, communication, ultimately to influence people's behaviors and hopefully lead to behavior change and increase levels of trust in information, especially in the world of misinformation that we live in. And then just to talk a little bit about, let me just put that on a full screen, about our approach, which is really about coordination and collaboration. Sometimes we got it hugely wrong, and I'm the first to admit that. But I think mostly we got it really right. The first 6 months was focused on preparing the country, supporting government, supporting business, as well as the health system, really, to meet the crisis needs and requirements as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And in the health response, where the bulk of our funding went to, we assisted with the scaling up of testing, sourcing and distributing PPE, ventilators, critical care equipment, as well as vaccinations towards the latter part of the pandemic. On the humanitarian side, our focus was in 2 areas. One, the food relief element, which saw itself play out in terms of food parcels at the very beginning of the pandemic, because that was the quickest way to get out and to reach vulnerable communities across the breadth of South Africa. Quickly pivoted to food vouchers, because I think we realized that we had to dignify people, no matter how vulnerable that they were in these dire circumstances, and give them the ability to choose those things that they wanted to procure in order for them to meet their food security requirements. The second area was gender-based violence, a very tough area, South Africa's ongoing pandemic. And we decided to support organizations initially to keep them safe, so that the victims that were finding themselves in those shelters were not at risk of contracting any COVID, as well as the workers in those environments, providing safe transport for victims. As we know, the numbers of the incidents of gender-based violence increased rapidly, especially during the hard lockdown at the very beginning of the pandemic. And then the second area, which is the gender-based violence, the second project we did was to provide grant funding to about 330 community-based organizations, just to give them a lifeline to continue providing the services, but at the very basic community level. So Umama, who's offering a shelter for young women and children that have been abused, we gave her a lifeline to be able to continue to provide those services. And then we had the behavior change, which was really about the communication campaigns that we did, sometimes getting it a little bit right and sometimes quite wrong in terms of how we collaborated with the social partners. I certainly got my hands burnt in this at the very beginning, but I think we got it right towards the end. Working with the National Communication Partnership, being a very strong voice in the National Communication Partnership, not only from a strategy perspective, but also from an implementation and collaboration perspective, and how we work together to avoid duplication. And then also supporting civil society organizations in terms of grants and funding so that they could do the work that we couldn't do. So our work was really focused on the big mass communication, whereas we then partnered with smaller civil society organizations to do what they do in the communities in terms of communication and spreading the word, and especially responding to some of the fears and concerns around vaccines. The Humanitarian Crisis Relief Fund was set up as a response to the July unrest that happened in KZN and parts of Gauteng, and really was split into food relief, business support, small business support, and providing funding for those small businesses to reestablish themselves. And then most recently, what we've called the flood response, in response to the devastating floods that have happened in KZN, as well as parts of the Eastern Cape. And there again, we're providing food essential products, psychosocial interventions, as well as what we're calling integrated shelter solutions in some of the identified areas. The lessons learned, we learned fast, but also we learned smart. I think having a clear purpose allowed for easier decision-making processes. The ability to coordinate and communicate ensured that we got the best results possible, working with a diverse array of partners who have strengths in very different areas, and pulling those and leveraging those for their ability to engage with audiences in meaningful ways. I think thinking outside the box all the time and seeing how we could do things more efficiently, more effectively, and really have the desired impacts with the vulnerable communities that we're working with. We also were quite clear about preserving our autonomy, that whilst we worked with government, we were a partner to them, but we were not actually government. And then obviously making sure that we leverage partners and activities for lasting impact beyond the immediate action. And the fact that we had an organization such as ours that was set up. And the big real lesson for us, though, is that there was a power in the spirit of solidarity and collaboration. In terms of some of the sort of sustainable outcomes of our collaborative approach, which we think can be used going forward in terms of, so we've looked at it from quite a number of perspectives. We talk about capacitation. So we think that we've helped to capacitate the national and provincial healthcare system. And I think it stands ready to tackle any future waves or any future calamities that require a health system response. We've provided, I think, long-term solutions. Our farming input vouchers, which were dispersed to over 60,000 subsistence farmers across the country for them to get input supplies and to secure food for their families, I think provided us with the ability to provide extended food security in those rural communities. And I think innovation in terms through limitation, I think also working with our partners in terms of us creating new thinking, creating new innovations, the digital food vouchers, the digital farming input vouchers, which can lead to, I think, better social assistance programs that the country as a whole can learn from. And I think lastly, creating synergies between organizations that have very different operating models and very different objectives, but all driven by this common purpose and goal, which is going to be very invaluable going forward. I don't know how to pronounce this word. I think it's replicability. But I think that the success of the fund has the potential, for certain interventions to continue beyond our lifetime. And with funding from either government or other non-government funding sources, and I think a lot of these programs can be taken forward, nuanced, tweaked, but to be made relevant to South Africa's socio-economic condition going forward. And I think lastly, in terms of education and information and communication, and I think that the campaigns that we've done together with the partners have helped to educate people on their responsibilities, on preventative measures, the importance of vaccination. But I think importantly, they also demonstrated the power of partnering with civil society, which is trusted by the people on the ground, and how we can leverage that, amplify that, and really have positive outcomes in terms of any programs that we continue to do. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Wendy. And that very unusual word, replicability, I think, is going to be very crucial moving forward. I mean, you mentioned issues of gender-based violence. I think we have a long way to go. The past weekend, I think most of us are still traumatized about what happened in this country. And I think we really need to act decisively in terms of what it is that we need to do in that space, learning from the social compact and the social partners that we've created in this journey of COVID that, like you say, can be replicabilitated elsewhere. Thank you very much for the time. And our next speaker will be Matthew Parks, who is the COSATU Parliamentary Coordinator. And I'm sure, Matthew, you're one of those people that don't need introduction. He's going to be speaking to us on partnering for relief and economic replacement. Over to you, Matthew. Thank you. Oh, and before you come in, Matthew, can I please encourage our delegates to ask questions or make comments, or online, and then we can chat that way, and then it will save us time towards the end. Thank you very much. Over to you, Andrew. Matthew.
Cool. No, thanks. Good morning, colleagues. Let me just upload a quick little PowerPoint. Good morning, colleagues. So I think I'm going to speak kind of from the perspective of organized labor at NEDLAC on some of the partnerships we did, especially around the relief and income replacement, which was really a huge chunk of the work that I think all of us collectively, not just as labor, but colleagues from business, from the UIF, the colleagues from NEDLAC. In the beginning of the lockdown, I think we were meeting literally 24/7. We had meetings till 11 o'clock at night. It was an intense period. But I think just kind of reflecting on the context and maybe stating the obvious a little bit, we went into a lockdown with very high levels of unemployment, over the 40%. And of course, we all know the huge problems of poverty and inequality. We were already an economy in deep recession, even before we had heard of COVID. We'd also seen real weakening of the capacity of the state on so many fronts, from that decade of state capture and corruption. I think we underestimated the level of the archaic systems in many parts of government, and in particular in the UIF, which really had an impact upon us. I remember when we first met, I think comrades Tony and I were kind of talking, and Jan and other comrades, that we really expected the UIF system to crash within about 3 or 4 days of what we went into the lockdown. I think also it had as a background of real challenges of a low level of trust towards the state amongst the public, amongst workers, but even towards ourselves as a kind of the political establishment, as business, as labor, as community organizations. We had literally, Chair, a couple of days to prepare for this shutdown. I think we sat together a couple of days before, tried to plot But yeah, it was unprecedented. I think we really experienced, difficulties of communicating what were often very complicated technical messages to our constituencies and to the public at large. I think the public itself was extremely fearful of what's happening. And, for all of us, this was really uncharted, unprecedented waters. So I think we can, all of us, be forgiven for the many mistakes that were encountered. A huge part of our work was really around the UF COVID-19 tears. And we really had massive fights at times to get the UF reinstated when it was stopped, to address real problems of backlogs. From a union level, there were significant campaigns by many unions in different parts of the economy to make sure that companies applied for the UF COVID tears, to make sure that money was paid to workers who hadn't received their salaries, to try to resolve disputes and backlogs. Often these disputes at a factory level actually almost became violent at times. I think there was a real effort by some unions to try to address the issues and to work systematically through it. I think we really appreciate the efforts of colleagues in business who really spent a huge amount of time availing staff to almost work full-time and assisting the UF to address issues, and even to try to offer kind of others assistance, whether it's IT assistance, hotline assistance, and so forth. And I think we really collectively worked as a team, as a UF, as business, as government, as NEDLAC, to try to resolve the issues, even whilst we did box each other often on a daily basis. And yeah, it was, there was multiple little teams working different aspects of the UF daily, literally. But I think there was a really strong spirit of social partnership across all of us, even when we did have very heated disagreements, very angry phone calls. I think we cursed each other's existence many a times. But I think all of us, irrespective of our grievances with each other, we all had the same objective of saving jobs, of saving companies, and of trying to cushion the economy. And in a nutshell, 5.5 million workers in the private sector, that's almost half the private sector workforce, received money. There was challenges of corruption and fraud. And again, I think it spoke to how we underestimated the capacity of the state. I think at times the state should have maybe been a bit more forthright with the challenge they experienced, as opposed to trying to say everything's okay when things are clearly not okay. But look, I mean, on a nutshell, and despite the many challenges, the many blunders, many grievances of workers, and I think probably about 1 million workers didn't get the payments for whatever reasons. But 5.5 million workers did get payments, 64 billion rand. That was the single largest injection of cash into the economy, and it was credit-free. So workers, if they would have received the money and they lost their jobs a year later, they wouldn't have been penalized for it. And we included workers who were not even up to date. The credits weren't paid, or they weren't registered with the UF on condition that the employer got into good standing. So it really was a generous intervention to the economy to assist people in the greatest challenges we've seen in our lifetimes. But look, I think kind of going forward, because I think the violence, the floods, etc., have showed us that we should be better prepared in future for these kind of disasters. We need to look at some things. So we need to address about the 4 million workers who are not on the UIF. So that's the 1.2 million public servants. It's the musicians, the artists, the kind of atypical workers. It's the e-platform workers. There's also workers who should already be registered, like the domestic and farm workers, SME workers. But we need to have a bit of a hybrid model which takes care of the varying types of employment, because the nature of work is evolving. We need to have a roadmap to include public service, because that can help to ensure that UIF remains financially sustainable. It gives a greater resources to it to provide solidarity to the most vulnerable, the most poor. As unions, we need to have better campaigns on the workplace level to make sure all workers are indeed registered, the contributions are up to date, because we saw significant amount of fraud at times when workers' money was deducted by the employer, but it wasn't paid to the UIF. I think the Department of Labour needs to do much more on compliance enforcement. And of course, colleagues in business too need to also help beat those drums. But we really do need to modernize UIF systems to make it easier for employees to register workers, make it easy to ensure rapid response times. And if you go to the UIF offices today, you'll still see queues around the street. So we shouldn't be having such situations where we have all the IT capacity available. We do need to have much stronger measures to prevent corruption and fraud. I think one lesson also we learned, Chair, is that we need to also, when the UF does investments, to make sure that there is sufficient assets easily available for future emergencies, because that was a real challenge, that assets were invested in property which you couldn't dispose of, like a shopping center, for example. On the COIDA front, I mean, this is a much smaller element of the work, But I mean, there was efforts to provide support for workers infected at work, but I think often it was difficult to prove that the infection took place at the work as opposed to the train or the community. But again, I think going forward, there's a real need to modernize the compensation fund systems to deal with backlogs, make it easier to apply and register, and make sure the money is paid quickly, because you have huge problems of workers struggling to get their monies. And again, a hybrid system which accommodates varying types of work. And also, I think, to make sure all workplace illnesses are covered, etc. And again, this is the thing that unions need to campaign for, to make sure workers are registered. And again, a bit of a more intensive approach by government to make sure there is compliance by the employer. I think we must really appreciate, and often we don't appreciate when we give government clubs, is that the SOD grant was the single biggest source of social assistance for the unemployed. 10 million people roughly received the SOD grant, and we know there's many issues in it, huge issues of payments, queues at the post office. But it was, about 44 billion rand per annum. That's something that we should appreciate. It was a significant source of stimulus in the local economy, but I think we really do need to appreciate the real pain of people sitting in queues, and of course the issues of corruption, etc. But I think going forward, it's a foundation for our BIG. We do need right now for government to take the administrative chaos much, much more seriously. We're quite worried about the drop for the delays in payments, one, and the drop in approvals to about 5 million persons. But going forward, we need to retain it and to see how can we link it to skills programs, to job placement programs, to help people find jobs. And I think also to see how can we raise it to the food poverty line. But the worst thing we can do is to abandon it. We can't afford a society where 12 million people, 14 million people have no source of income. I think of the LGS, we spent a lot of time on it, and I think it was a point of frustration for all of us. We had the 200 billion rand committed by government. I think, if I'm right, about 18 billion rand was dispensed at the end of the day. It could be a little bit more. It could be about 23 billion rand. But yeah, a significant crisis that there was really overtly stringent lending criteria. There was efforts by the president, by Treasury, to try to address those criteria, but we don't think it really made much difference. And sure, to be fair, many companies in an uncertain economy were fearful of also incurring additional debt. We think there was real problems also communicating it to businesses, to SMEs. Going forward also is quite worrying that we look at the bounce back scheme, which is kind of the successor to it. I'm not sure if we're learning the lessons to the LGS mistakes. Are we making sure that the approach, the assistance given is creative enough? Are we looking at combining grants and equity in exchange for incentivizing and creating jobs? Because we should be seeking to give every possible assistance to growing the economy, to helping people find jobs, as opposed to being overtly conservative at times. Not that it must be reckless, but let's weigh up the broader public good. On the tax relief front, I think, there was a significant effort by Treasury. This is really quite fast and efficient relief. I think it helped many companies to survive. And of course, we know that the immediate tax relief in the beginning for the first 3 months, and there was some additional tax relief for the liquor industry, etc. But perhaps, going forward, we should also be thinking creatively and, being fair to the fiscus as well, which is under real pressure. But how could tax relief in future be used for future emergencies? How could it be used better to help nurture battling industries or businesses, to incentivize job creation? Could we look at lower tax rates for companies, the SMEs, which are really struggling, But I think some kind of creative thought going forward, as opposed to just a one-size-fits-all kind of regime, which we currently roughly have. On the food parcels, I think we saw in July 2021, the colleagues in SASSA did distribute quite a significant amount of food parcels. I think this was, significantly fast relief for the poor and the desperate. Of course, there was also some instances of corruption that we also saw too. But I think going forward, our task would be to ensure we really do have a comprehensive database of the unemployed, the indigent, the homeless. How can we better open civil society, especially the churches, to help with distribution? What are the kind of rapid distribution systems we do need? And of course, measures to prevent corruption. I think on SASSA last year, I think it did assist thousands of people and businesses affected by the violence.
Comrade Tony, I'm going to ask you to please wind down. We can talk about these ones. I'm sorry to really interrupt. We can talk about these maybe during Q&As or whatever, but I'll give you a minute or so just to wind down. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I'm almost done, Chair. So I think just going forward, I think it's about making sure SASSA is adequately resourced and that everybody, business and towns, persons, especially in towns and rural areas, are aware of it and how to apply for it. On the consumer relief front, those points I mentioned before were all essentially government relief. I don't think we saw the same amount of relief coming from the private sector. So there was some commercial bank relief, 3 months relief to clients, that was positive. But the insurance companies, I think, really were not part of the party. There was a real reluctance for them to engage, to provide relief to customers, yet often they were making significant profits because of lower insurance claims. And often, in fact, they actually increased consumers' premiums. So I think we do need to have a discussion about that and a better culture of shareholder activism and patriotism from those parts of society, industry. But I think in conclusion, Chair, I think the social partnership was really a positive success of COVID-19. I think there was a real building of partnership between government and social partners. It lays a positive foundation for social compact and rebuilding the country. We do need to kind of build upon this to address our current crises. But I think there's also a need for us to introspect about our challenges we experience as government and social partners to enforce our commitments. Not every business, not every worker is organized. There is challenges of community representation. But I think we did a positive there. We need to really kind of build upon the trust among social partners, but also build the trust among society, which is correctly skeptical of all of us. There's a need to have more effective communications amongst all of us. But I think there was really excellent, work that colleagues in government, in business and labor and civil society did. And I think these are already at times unsung heroes, what commerce and business did on the ground, in the restaurant sector, what sector clothing workers did, what the colleagues in UF to the best extent did. But I think also lastly, Chair, I think it would be correct for us to really appreciate the work done by our colleagues in NEDLAC. I don't think we would have had the same success as many of these issues if we didn't have the ED of NEDLAC and her team. They really did a huge amount of work under unbelievable pressure. And I think they made it so much easier for all of us as social partners to play our role. So I think from Labour side, I really want to kind of appreciate Lisa and her team and just to say thanks for that. Because I think they just played such a huge, huge role. And that really made it possible for so many things to be dealt with. But yeah, thanks very much, Chair. And apologies if I took long.
Thank you, Matthew. And I'm sure we all share the same sentiments about, Lisa and team. And they have a lot of work to still do. Can't wait for the final report that will chart how we move forward into the future. Our next speaker is really doesn't need much introduction. Kes Kovadia, who is the CEO of BUSA. Kes will be talking to us this morning about the B4SA vaccination partnership. Kes, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Neo. And if the presentation could just go up, please. Thank you. I'm not going to spend time on all the slides. I'll concentrate on a few. Let me start by also commending NEDLAC for the work NEDLAC has done on this and pulling us together, as well as commending all social partners. I think Matthew is absolutely correct that we work well together. It was a robust partnership, but it was a partnership that produced results. And we are very happy that we're part of that process. Next slide, please. Let me just start by saying why B4SA and what we did in the beginning. So when COVID hit, we got a lot of queries at BUSA from BUSA members as well as others on some guidance during this process. And what we felt we needed to do is to establish a broad business platform so that we can also engage members, people who are not members of BUSA. And we felt that if we're going to make a difference in working with social partners to manage the pandemic, we needed to develop a platform, which was essentially an implementation platform that was able to have a project management approach to addressing the pandemic, which was able to be flexible and which was able to actually attract the necessary skills, capacity, and expertise to assist us in doing this. And we felt that an implementation platform of the type that we established through B4SA would be the appropriate way to go. So we had, you can see, 3 working groups. We had We achieved PPE portal was set up, mobilized companies in the healthcare industry, integrated economic and healthcare model, championed process for UIF benefit, which Matthew has talked to, was NEDLAC accelerated, developed an accelerated economic recovery plan. Toward the end of 2020, we started demobilizing B4SA because we were quite clear that this wasn't an organization that would continue. There was no need for it to continue, a platform that would continue. And as we moved out of managing the pandemic, we started demobilizing, but then had to remobilize again. And Busa has taken the view that we will remobilize the B4SA platform as and when it is necessary to do so, to address and look at businesses' participation with other stakeholders in projects of national importance. And so we remobilized to work with government and social partners to roll out the vaccines in 2021, and we developed those 5 work streams. Next slide, please. This is just talking about how we rapidly remobilized in 2021. In January 21, we remobilized the organization, had leadership meetings with government leadership. We met with the president, the minister of finance at that time, the minister of health at that time, engaged with all social partners, and B4SA directed all its efforts toward mobilizing business, and with NDOH, Treasury, GCIS, NEDLAC, the SF, and others, created infrastructure, including JSOC, War Room, VACSOC, and so on. And the whole idea was to mobilize and coordinate weekly efforts of government, business, labor, civil society, and faith communities to deliver the national vaccination program. Next slide, please. This just talks about the structures. It was an extraordinary public-private partnership with regular and direct engagement with government at all levels. I talked about JSOC, engaged with National Treasury and Presidency, talked about B4SA and what it did in mobilizing social partners and business. We had a group that was the B4SA lead, and then government leads, and then the work stream that we established, and regular meetings at JSOC, at times twice a week in the early stages of the vaccination rollout. Next slide, please. This is just an indication of the industry experience we harness and utilize in the national effort. So we had planning, integration, and implementation, communications, logistics, coordination, legal and regulatory service delivery, information systems, risk assurance. At the height of managing the vaccine rollout, we probably had about 50 experts and professionals from the business sector in these areas working on a pro bono basis to help us do this. Next slide. These are just the work streams that we delivered success across all work streams: vaccination free at point of access, and finalize the vaccination price, admin fees, and credit note mechanisms. We had 500 volunteers over and above the 50 who worked full-time to mobilize expertise. Vaccine, we developed and implemented brand new reimbursement systems for the private sector, participation in delivering vaccines to public sector as well. 1/3 of capacity for vaccine jabs came from the private sector. We had detailed joint modeling to allocate vaccination sites and vaccine take-up, lots of stakeholder engagement, and then vaccine logistics and cold chain distribution plan for public and private sector, supply chain risk plan, created dashboard and tracking mechanisms on an ongoing basis, so that at the JSOC meeting, we could have virtually real-time information and were able to track progress. Next slide, please. Then just to recap, we launched the program on the 17th of May after a setback as a result of supply constraints. South Africa took a decision to halt its rollout of Oxford AstraZeneca early in February. We started the Sisonke program to vaccinate 500,000 healthcare workers February, March. May to July, we started prioritizing over 60, then remaining healthcare workers, extended to over 50 on 1st July, 35 to 49, 15th July. And the delivery of J&J doses was impacted by the contamination that we all know about. 20th of August, rollout extended to all those over 18, and August 2021 onwards, we then extended and really ramped up the progress on vaccinations. Next slide, please. This is just an indication of the sites. So we had 60 million doses procured and over 55.2 million delivered. Stock constraint in June, July, regular deliveries from August onwards. At the peak, sites provided 420,000 vaccinations per day, 160,000 in the private sector. And the private sites initially restricted allocations of vaccines, increasing to 30% and then fully opened according to orders that were placed. So this just gives you an indication of the sites we established, the jabs between J&J and Pfizer that we put into people's arms, and that at its height was very, very effective. Next slide, please. The private sites provided about 160K per day at its capacity. This is just an indication of sites ramped up at existing sites depending on demand. Sites reached a steady state of capacity September onwards. Capacity gradually reduced from November onwards in line with demand. And in 2022, right now, mainly pharmacies, vaccination in private sector as vaccination becomes integrated into the primary healthcare services. And this just gives you an indication of the sites, hospitals, non-health establishments, pharmacies, GPs, workplace sites, total private sector sites, and then the public sector sites, and then the total between public and private sector. Next slide, please. This again gives you 37 million administered to date, 30%, as I said, in private sector sites. This gives you an indication of the volumes of vaccine doses administered in the top graph, and give you an indication of the fully vaccination percentage of each age group from 60 plus through to 12 to 17 as of 1st of April 2022. Next slide, please. So some examples of B4S and government operating in full collaboration. Drive-through mosques in Gauteng, in partnership with the Gauteng government, were used as vaccination sites. Mining companies partnering with Limpopo government to provide community vaccination sites. Partnership between WCG departments and other organizations. 173 private vaccination sites are established. Vaccinations delivered across the Western Cape through collaboration between the Department of Economic Development, Tourism, Department of the Premier, Department of Health, B4SA Westgrove, and the private sector. So these were just examples of the sorts of partnerships we put together to actually deliver vaccines as quickly as possible. Next slide, please.
1 more minute for you, Kaz.
Okay. What have been the achievements? And I think this is important. There's been an unprecedented partnership between all stakeholders, credible brand, which we can use on an ongoing basis for national interest issues. Business was able to play an increasing role in all aspects of national response. Volunteers came to the party, and we believe we can mobilize on an ongoing basis if we need to. National solutions were created. Business demonstrated itself as a national asset, and we built some degree of trust and mobilized private healthcare capacity to a great extent. Next one. Transitioning the vaccine rollout program, I said earlier, it's now part of the sort of healthcare system, and private sector sites are administering this on an ongoing basis. Next slide, last one. And working collaborative drive inclusive economic growth. We believe that the lessons we've learned can actually take us through combining resources and capabilities, continuous engagement and alignment, joint communication. All stakeholders recognize that economic growth is the most effective instrument. Private sector investment is a key lever. We believe we need to build on these relationships for things like the NHI, investment and growth and so on, and make the whole ecosystem work. And we should learn from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kez. We will now move to the next session of our program. Andrew, I know you've got a hard stop now at 10 o'clock because you've got another engagement. If I may start with you, Andrew, you know, I heard all the good work that you've done from a food security perspective. And I just want to find out, what is it that we can do better as a country? Bearing in mind that 10 million tons of food goes to waste every year in South Africa. And yet so many people go to bed hungry every night.
Yeah.
The one thing I can think of working in this industry is that some of the regulations that we have, like the Consumer Protection Act, you know, prohibits, for example, retailers giving away
it's a convenient time.
Kez, please mute. Like as I was saying, some of the regulations or legislation prohibits retailers. You know, on a packet you'll have sell by date, best before. That doesn't mean that the food is actually bad, but they are not allowed to give it away to indigent families or those that are in need. What is it that we can do as a country to improve the distribution of food and food security in our country?
Yeah, thanks, Neo. So I think we need to circularize our economy more, and certainly food waste has to be a huge focus for two purposes. One is there's a lot of food that can be safely and healthily reused by people, and there are some very exciting organizations that are doing that on a full-time basis. Secondly, the food that can't be reused safely by human beings needs to go into compost for urban, peri-urban and rural farmers, because we've got to improve our soils. So you've got to plow the excess food back into compost. And I think that, again, there are some exciting examples of that. The final point I would make is that, which I referred to in my presentation, we do not have an integrated approach in terms of national policy towards food security. There are competing interpretations and approaches and framing of the problem. Some people say we must just produce more food. How people eat it is not our problem. Others say it's a matter for rural development. Others say we need more food aid. And others look at it from a nutrition and children and mothers' point of view. None of these approaches is necessarily wrong, but it's only part of the story, and we need an integrated approach combining all those issues together. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And I guess, you know, one of the things that we actually saw during the riots as well is that not only are there different interpretations, we do not have a national database where one can go and say, you know, how and do we distribute food very quickly and to who? So we are not sure as a country, and I have no doubt that the Department of Social Development, as an example, may have that database. But what is missing is that coordination between all the role players to ensure that consistently we provide food security to those that are in need, but more importantly, that we're able to move very, very quickly if and when we need to actually provide that food. So Andrew, thank you. I know it's almost 1 minute to 10. Thank you for your contribution, and we look forward to engaging with you further in future. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks. If I move to before we go to the questions that I think partly answered. Lisa, I think a critical question that has been asked on the group has to do with the social partners at NEDLAC. That, you know, some feel that it may not necessarily be very representative of, the entire value chain of civil society. And the question is, how do we get more participation from those that may not necessarily be represented at this stage? Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I think that is an important question. It's actually a question from my namesake. And in a sense, it's not really an answer that I can give. I do believe that partnership can always be enriched by increased participation and greater diversity. And I think that there are strengths in partnership, not necessarily threats. However, the way that NEDLAC is currently structured is that really the constituencies of apply to NEDLAC, come, to be part of NEDLAC. And I do know that at the moment, there is an initiative among civil society organizations, coordinated to some extent by the existing community participants in NEDLAC, to try and broaden their participation. Since NEDLAC started, there are many more and a greater diversity of civil society organizations than there were initially, represented as only youth, women, civics, and so on. And in fact, there is a social summit starting on Thursday, where I think a much broader range of civil society organizations have been invited. And I am hoping that from there, there will be a move to greater representation. But I think that question should also be directed to community participants who currently participate in NEDLAC. And I'm not sure, because I can't see who all the participants are, but maybe if there is somebody from the NEDLAC community constituency, they should also answer this question. Thanks.
I think I might have seen Mabalani at some stage. Mabalani, are you on the call? Or Jan Mahlangu? Jan, I can see you. Perhaps while Jan is
me now.
Good morning.
Morning. I don't represent community. I'm from Kosato. If the question is representative, please. Unless I've
crossed floors. No, I know you haven't.
No,
Sorry about that. Is there anybody from the community sector? If not, I think it's something, Lisa, that we can consider in some of our future engagements. But I think you've aptly answered this question, and there are opportunities to consider how this can change into the future, given the fact that it's evolved very well so far, but needs to evolve even better. Are there any questions? Because I don't want to turn this into a dialogue. Are there questions from the floor or comments that people would like to raise? I know when I spoke to you earlier on, Chifiwa, some relevance in sharing the experiences of the tourism sector in relation to COVID. Chifiwa? Not sure if Chifiwa is still here. I don't see him anymore. Okay, if that, there he is. Thanks, Chifiwa.
I'm here. I had to be unmuted. I do believe, though, we need to start moving away from being on the Zoom into conference rooms to support the tourism industry, and to go back to some level of normalcy, but without ignoring the benefits of technology. Thank you very much. Now, look, I do things. I've been listening actively from the presentation. It takes one back to the beginning of this pandemic, and lots of unknowns, and dealing with a situation that we've never dealt with, and the responses that we had to learn from, looking in hindsight now. But I do believe that the platforms that we have created has really helped us to unlock the economy of the country, to reopen the country, to manage the pandemic, and to really put us in a trajectory that we're in today. However, there's lessons to be learned, and from the tourism industry, coming out of this, we have lost some major companies. This ranges from airlines that we've lost, ranges from hotels that have moved away. It ranges from the employees that have been affected due to these closures. From our side, we used to employ about 1.5 million individuals here at home, both direct and indirect. And now, we're at half, although we are recovering at a faster pace. If you look into the car rental space, car rentals, I remember in the beginning of the pandemic, the likes of Avis, they didn't even have enough space to park the vehicles because their vehicles were rotating. They were hired, they were always on the road. They never had space to park each and every vehicle. And, I remember, them having to find a farm where they can drive all these vehicles and park them there and try to sell as much as they can. And if we look today, they have a shortage of vehicles because business has started to come back. I think that, there are lessons to be learned in terms of how, we approach certain things, although one has to look at it, with the same eye and the same information that we had at that particular time. The issues around, closure of interprovincial travel had a devastating impact on our industry. We have seen firsthand how, it drove, many people, to hunger within communities. We've seen the industry rising up and trying to figure out how to assist the employees, although there was no income that was flowing into the businesses. And I think, the reopening, brought hope. When we reopen, when we start to understand more and more about the pandemic, it brought hope, and more people, went back to work. The issue of UIF was the issue that we constantly dealt with. We had meetings in the evenings over the weekend to try to make sure that the employees do get what's due to them from UIF. That was one of the most difficult things, I must say, to resolve, because you constantly have employees on a day-to-day basis saying, I haven't received anything. And when one carries all these emotions into the meetings, sometimes we would get flared up and say things that perhaps were not professional at that point in time. But we had to carry the pains of the industry, the pains of those that work within the industry. So that was one thing that I believe in the future, we need to have a system that works for everyone and to the benefit of the employees. Of course, the issue around the closure of the liquor was a contentious issue, and the understanding thereof why it was being done or why it shouldn't be done, and the debates around it, which are all well known. I think those were quite heated, and the justification from our side as business to how things should be done, although it was eventually done, it took a long time to get to that. And of course, the last part, the issue around gatherings took even longer time because it was the last one to be reopened. And we have seen the devastation from our side, especially from small businesses that still have not recovered. It's gonna take a bit of time for them to recover. What I can say, what we are seeing now is that we're starting to see a faster pace of recovery within our sector. It will be impacted by lack of air capacity because we don't have British Airways, Come, which own British Airways and Kulula. So we will have bottlenecks. We need to solve that situation for the tourism economy to grow. Internationally, we still are struggling, but most of international were not for our own doing. It was mostly that there's more and more that's coming in, and the recovery from where we projected, it's going ahead in full steam, and more people are getting back to work. More people are getting back to full salaries pre-COVID, which is a good thing, but there's still a whole lot more work to be done because we've lost 2.5 years that we still need to recover But our growth will surpass the economic growth. When we did projection, it will be higher than the GDP growth. And we will, in the next 5 years, we should reach the levels of about 2 million jobs within our sector. So it's looking good. However, we need to be cautious because we never know from the global environment what's going to happen as we hear many different things across the world. Thank you.
Thank you. And just on that note, we're hearing, when COVID started, it started with just one death here, and now monkeypox is another thing that we possibly should actually look out for. And talking about recovery, Kez, looking at the presentation that you made, and in my opening remarks, talking about a new social compact that is required going forward, because issues of economic recovery and reconstruction are very, very key. And it is critical that we start moving ahead with full speed. What are the plans? What are the plans on the table from a B4SA perspective, from this new social compact that needs to be entered into so that we start recovering as a country?
Yeah. So Neil, I mean, as you know, the president announced the intention to have a social compact in Isona in February, and that process is underway. We will, as BUSA, definitely participate in the process, but we also have taken the view that government needs to take some leadership in the whole process about attracting investment and bringing about growth. And what we mean by that is that government should, as a parallel process to the social compact, be also having bilaterals with social partners, where government feels, and we believe that the bilaterals, certainly we convinced that bilaterals between business and government will result quicker in identifying critical areas that we can implement and begin to implement, because I think that's the test. I think the public also wants to see that we're beginning to implement stuff and not just talking about stuff. And that government, if government then feels that, let's say for argument's sake, labor and business should meet to discuss some particular issue, they must bring us together. And if we agree on that issue, great. If we don't agree, government needs to make a call and give some direction. So we believe that we'll participate in the social compact process. Government has indicated that they want a process for the next few months so that the president can announce something in SONA 2023, and we'll participate in that. But we believe that the bilaterals are also critical. We have identified critical priority interventions that we want to engage government on, and we will want to do that. And between those two, bilaterals and a multilateral process towards a social compact, we believe that we should be able to make some progress.
Thank you very much indeed, Kez. I see, there's just one more question before we move towards wrapping up. It's a question about NHI. It says, does the experience of the pandemic and collaboration teach us anything about NHI? Your views, Kez?
I think we're going to need to collaborate on the whole NHI debate. And I think what was, in our view, why we collaborated so well during the COVID pandemic and the vaccines is that we had a particular focus, and that was to manage the pandemic and to distribute as many vaccines as possible, or get as many people vaccinated as possible. And we all knew, all social partners knew that if we don't get our act together, if we don't manage the pandemic effectively, we don't get as many people vaccinated as possible, people are going to die. So there was a clear focus, right? I think the NHI is also a clear focus. And the focus has got to be that we agree on universal healthcare. But we've got to collaborate and be pragmatic about how we get there and how we utilize all the resources in the country to do that. So we would be, we would say that let's not break what's working. So the private healthcare system is working. It may not be working for as many people as we would like it to work for. Well, let's address that. But let's not have a situation where we say either the private healthcare system or the public healthcare system, or we need to possibly put the private healthcare system at risk because we want universal healthcare. I don't think those are the discussions to have. And I think that because we can focus on universal healthcare within the context of an appropriate collaboration between the public and private healthcare system, I think that we can extrapolate the lessons of the B4SA experience with other social partners and apply that to the NHI. And that's certainly our intention, and that's the basis on which we want to engage on the NHI.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kes. I'd like to, as we wrap up, thank the panelists, who joined us this morning, and the delegates. And Lisa, thank you very much for this opportunity to facilitate. Can I hand over to you to make the closing remarks? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Nia, and thank you again to the panelists. I think we heard about a lot of different things, but actually the thing that sticks in my mind, more than even the importance of partnership, is that how many lessons we learned on how to implement and how to implement speedily and effectively. And I think, maybe Wendy talked about replicability, but I think the biggest challenge going forward is how to replicate the ways in which we worked, the project management approaches, as Andrew says, don't plan too much, then adapt and adjust, might be some of the biggest lessons that we can take from this COVID experience. Again, I hope that those of you that joined in have been able to learn and appreciate what different actors in our society were able to do over those very long 2 years. It's hard now, as we emerge from the COVID pandemic, almost to realize how hard it was and how much trauma and tragedy there was. And as I end, I thought we should remember Rob Lee, who was from B4SA. He was part of the labor work stream. And, he was very instrumental in getting the UI COVID tours off the ground and ensuring that workers did get the income replacement. Maybe as an announcement as we close, as I said, these were 2 webinars that were focusing on lessons. We are having a 3rd event in 2 weeks' time on the 16th of August. That is going to be a different kind of event. We're really launching a legacy project focusing on workplace health and safety. We are partnering as NEDLAC with the National Institute for Occupational Health on developing a range of training materials that can be used by workers and employers in the workplace, both to continue to manage the COVID pandemic and also improve health and safety. But for those of you who are part of the NEDLAC mailing list, we will be inviting you shortly, and that meeting will be addressed by Salim Abdul Karim, as well as the Deputy Minister of Labour. But thank you everybody for participating, and I hope, as we used to say in the time of COVID, stay safe. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.